Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I thought I'd make a bit of a special episode today. And this episode is actually about my journey into breath and how I got into the fascination of science around breathing and the journey from being young to where I am now. And it's a bit different to usual. Don't think I've shared much of my story on this channel. I don't think I've shared much of my story on the podcast or even too much publicly. And I thought it'd be nice for people who are interested in not only what I do, but maybe interested in myself to hear the journey and to hear where I've gone. So what I want really to take you back to the beginning is just the fact that I've always been fascinated with the human body. I can remember my favorite book as a child was the Funny Bones book and the Funny Bones riddle. And it was all about connecting the bones and understanding the human skeleton system. And it had stories around that. And then when I was in school, I just excelled in science and physical education. I think in my school, I was the first person to get ever pretty much 100% in all of his exams around physical education, around sports and understanding fitness and stuff like that. And that obviously inspired me to pursue that at a deeper form of education. So I did go on to do a degree in sports and exercise physiology at Nottingham-Trent University over in the UK, which is where I was born in Coventry in the UK and moved there when I was 18 years old. And I remember university for me was the easy side of it was the education. I grasped and understand things so well in my prior years. I felt the first year, my second year, I barely had to pay attention to what was going on and I could still understand things. So on reflection, I was probably excelled nowhere near as well as I could do in education when I was at university because it was half-hearted. My main focus was on socialization and enjoying the rugby team and banter and alcohol and partying a lot and spending my money and time more invested in those and girls, which was, in hindsight, it was an amazing experience. But yeah, certainly could have done better academically in my first and second and third years, having to play catch up in my third year a fair bit. However, in my exercise physiology classes, we did have two respiratory scientists, respiratory physiologists, who were the professors, Professor Graham Sharp and Dr. Mike Johnson, who were both still, I believe, at Nottingham-Trent University. And their research area was in respiratory physiology. And there was a particular lab. So we go to once every 2 weeks or once a month, I remember, that we go into the lab to do practical stuff, obviously to do the scientific experiments and learn hands-on science. And there was one lab that was on inspiratory muscle training, lung function, testing the diaphragm and the strength of the diaphragm. And there was a little device. So the way that we measure strength of diaphragm is through trying to see how much pressure we can generate against a closed glottis when we breathe. So you have to empty your lungs, you put this device in your mouth, you pull it as hard as you can against it, and it has a closed glottis, so you're generating a negative pressure, and it gives you a digital reading. And you do it 3 or 4 or 5 times and you see what your best is within the range of 10%. And the average individual would get around between 100 and 120. And I remember my friend, Alex, he got around about 150, 160, and it was, wow, that's pretty good. And I remember the professor saying to him at the time, yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, that's probably around the highest that we potentially see. And when it came to my go, being the competitive person I am, him being my housemate and friend, I'll give it a real good shot. And I think I remember getting around maybe 200, 220 first time. And it was, whoa, like I did not expect that. Others didn't expect it. And the lecturer actually said to us, can you do it again? So I repeated it again. I ended up getting around about 220, 230, my maximum. So that was a kind of why am I so far ahead? So it made me very curious, about what is going on. And actually the lecturers were curious about it as well. So they invited me into the lab to do more tests, and one of the tests was like doing a bleep test. And so have you ever heard of a bleep test before to measure fitness? It's almost like you have to run between a 20-meter period, I think it's 20 meters or 30 meters, time into the bleeps, and the bleeps get faster to make it more challenging, and you have to continue to go until you can't make the bleeps, and that's your score of your fitness. And this breathing kind of bleep test was more so weights that were stacked on top of each other, and you had to breathe against a rhythm. And every now and then they would drop an extra weight to increase the resistance. And as I went through it, it was just completely stacking the weights on top and top until the weights were completely finished and I was still breathing against it. And they were like, oh, we've never actually seen this before. Would you mind if you'd take part in the part of a research project that we're doing? And that research project was essentially looking at utilizing hyperventilation post-exercise, so over-breathing post-exercise with a resistance to see whether it would increase the buffering of acid and lactate, because the diaphragm is a muscle that can buffer acid quite well. Could that improve accelerate the recovery process rather than doing a passive recovery or an active recovery after exercise? And they kept the CO2 levels at the same range, so we could hyperventilate without actually going into a respiratory alkalosis and blowing off too much CO2, going hypercapnic, going dizzy, by supplementing with CO2 and keeping that in a stable range. And that then I became a student in that. And then the following year, I did a master's degree. And my master's degree was a research master's, which again was with the same team. And I eventually ended up doing my research, joining that project, and then also joining a guy called Dr. Dean Mills, who's actually at the University of South Queensland in Brisbane now, I believe. And he was doing a research project on looking at inspiratory muscle training and respiratory muscle fatigue and the ventilation itself during exercise and how much inflammation it causes, and whether we can use inspiratory muscle training to reduce that inflammation. And the techniques and tests and things that I learned during that year was some very advanced stuff. It was putting balloons into the body, so up the nose, into the airway, into the esophagus, so you could swallow it down. You could have a balloon pressure below the diaphragm and above, so one just above the stomach and then deep in below the stomach, and that can measure the transdiaphragmatic pressure, the pressure that the diaphragm is generating. And then you could use metronomes and force rate control to actually mimic what you were doing during exercise. So we could then take the breathing of exercise itself, say in a VO2 max test, and mimic it to see how much inflammation the breathing alone during exercise causes inflammation, and then use tools to look at inspiratory muscle training to reduce that inflammation. And we published a couple of papers actually on this. And I was glad to be a part of that, and it was an amazing time. But I was a little bit out my depth in the knowledge, if I'm honest with you. I think I'd spent the year prior, third year, chasing up that when it came to really doing that master's degree, I was almost a bit like, I'm not fully grasping this 100% to the depth that I want to. So I came out quite lacking confidence. I was also struggling with my mental health at the time as well, and really was struggling with a relationship that was going on for a bit too long, and struggling financially, struggling sleeping wise, and working away from the place that I was living in. Didn't have my own home, so I was very unsettled during that period. But eventually I managed to come out with a master's of research, and the goal was then to get into sports science. And I applied for a PhD with the Brisbane Broncos rugby league team in Brisbane. I'd always wanted to live in Australia. I'd been a rugby player all my life. I'd spent the majority of my time in rugby as a president of the rugby team at university. I had injuries, so I couldn't play. And I wanted to pursue that as a career. I got down to the final two and then didn't end up getting it. So that was a bit of a knock of confidence that I didn't end up getting that role. However, an opportunity came up to look for a scholarship on the National School of Healthcare Scientists. So this was in the NHS over in the UK. They were looking to recruit high-level scientists that were coming out of the universities into the medical space, into the hospitals over there, because there was a lot of senior doctors and senior physicians and senior scientists that were retiring, but there weren't many coming through. So the government kind of created this scheme to try and welcome scientists to come through, and it was a 3-year paid scholarship. And there was different sections as a clinical scientist. There was cardiac, there was radiology, there was blood work, there was vascular, and of course there was respiratory and sleep. And with my background, I thought, well, this is the perfect opportunity, and I'll apply. It was a very rigorous kind of protocol. We had to do aptitude tests, we had to do applications, we had to do like a speed dating interviewing sort of thing to get in. And then we had to see like our managers of the place where they're facilitating for a private conversation. And eventually I ended up getting accepted I think there was over 1,000 applicants to spaces, about 8 spaces or 7 spaces across the whole of the UK. And fortunately I got a position back in Nottingham again at the university hospitals there. So I ended up training as a clinical scientist in respiratory and sleep science. And the first year was like an introduction. And again, it was like, this was where I started to switch my mind on seriously about science. I knew that I was now training in a career. And I knew that I needed to up my game, because I was going through life taking the easy route and just scraping by to get enough to get the degree, to get the qualification, to move to the next step. And this was now at a point where I was like, I really need to make a career of this. And I remember going, I'm going to knuckle down. And the first year was rotations. So I had to do a rotation in the cardiac, in the vascular, in respiratory. I was based in respiratory and sleep, and then I had a freedom to have a look around the hospital and really choose what I wanted to investigate. And it was amazing. I got to saw a triple heart bypass, got to saw amputations. I got to sit in MDT meetings where they were talking about morbidity and mortality cases, reflecting on where people had died, and they were looking at decision making. I got to pull vascular veins out of people's legs. I got to learn how to scan, take blood tests, read blood tests. So it was a very solid foundation, as well as obviously the skills in understanding the heart, ECGs, and the respiratory and the basics of respiratory and sleep. The second and third year were then honed in and specialized just in respiratory and sleep. And that's where I learned more details of how to run clinical exercise tests, lung function tests, understanding hypoxia, hypercapnia, understanding ventilation, understanding CPAP, understanding sickness and disease in this, respiratory failure, and how to monitor these things. And that is where I really started to navigate my understanding of how to apply science in a clinical way. And it probably was the most enjoyable 3 years of my life, because it was, whilst it was intense training, I was left to my autonomy to really take to that training on my own. So there was a bit of freedom and creativity, and I had amazing mentors. I really enjoyed my time there. And then I had this commitment that in my third year, I was like, I wanted to move to Australia. I failed to get the job with the Brisbane Broncos. At the time, I had a couple of years before, I had a girlfriend who didn't want to leave their family around. So I decided here's another time to see if there's a job in Australia. So what I did was, just went on seek.com.au, which is basically like job seekers for Australia. And I typed in respiratory and sleep scientist. And there was a job in Perth, Western Australia, for a company called Respiratory Sleep, a private company. And I thought, why not apply? Just apply and see how it goes, and maybe that be your next step that you can take. If not, then there's plenty of opportunities here. You've done very well, been very successful. The universities are pushing you. I know that the fact that the hospital that I was working at, they would take me on full time if I was to stick around. So I felt that freedom to go, what can I do next in my life? And that was it. I applied, ended up interviewing with the CEO of the company on the other side of the world twice, the manager, the senior leadership teams over there, the HR teams. And then they put an application in for sponsorship, and it turns out that they got granted for an application. And that was when I told my mom. That was when I told my mom and my dad that I'm moving to Australia, and I've been granted a visa, or applying for sponsorship, and I'm applying for a visa. So that closed off the time where I was training as a clinical scientist. And between the time of finishing that role and leaving to Australia, I got a job in London at St. Bart's Hospital. And St. Bart's Hospital is, at least the cardiology department there, is the largest cardiology system, one of the most advanced cardiology departments in the whole of Europe. And my role was to come in and to do exercise tests on people with cardiac issues. So myopathy issues to do with musculature problems, and congenital heart problems. So problems where they've got issues with their heart from birth and defects with the heart, holes in the heart and stuff. And stress these individuals and look at what's going on with their breathing, what's going on with their metabolic system, what's going on with the cardiac system, and write the reports and the recommendations for doctors based off their physiology. And that was a period where I got to live in London on a very good wage, and really had some kind of freedom to explore who I was a little bit beyond beyond just my career, which was amazing to do that in London, spending a lot of times exploring and navigating. However, after about 4 months, I believe it was, I actually got my visa come through, and I had it in my contract that once my visa was through, I had to leave and go over to Australia in the space of 4 weeks. So this was just after Christmas 2015, and I flew out on the 26th of January, which is Australia Day, and I landed on the 27th of January in the middle of the summer in Perth, Western Australia, knowing only one person. That person worked in the mines, Jack Frater. Appreciate the support that he had in finding me a place to live with his cousins immediately. And I was just taken away with being in this island, this place where it's just the whole coast is just a golden sand beach. There's blue ocean, boiling hot. It was bright. People walking around barefoot to get down to the beach, and all you can see is just everyone just smiling, laughing. And I just fell in love with the place straight away. However, when I started the job, I was like, oh, it seems as though I've taken a step back here. I'm used to very advanced equipment, the new protocols, new techniques, the data science, and I've moved to Perth, Western Australia, and it seems as though this company is running a bit dated, a bit old school, and I come in very excited and very kind of wanting to impress, really. And show that I've been this upcoming scientist over in the UK. I'm here to make a mark and show who I am. And that was received welcoming, but I was the new guy. So I felt like I was pushed into the corner, like, this is the role that you need to do. You're over here. In fact, you need to go and work in this specific clinic because you're a new person. I was at the bottom of the hierarchy, although I guess my ego didn't really want to be at that bottom of the hierarchy because I felt, or maybe had been inflated by the previous roles that I'd done. So I professionally felt a bit stalemate. I felt a bit stuck. I felt like I wasn't heard or listened to for a period. And so my life went off more so, let's figure out who you are. You're single, you're other side of the world, you're 27 years old. Why not figure out who you are as a person and go figure out friends and loved ones over there? And that was when I had probably 6 months of the most fun-filled part of my life, like in terms of just not caring and not worrying about anything, but also spending a lot of money and drinking a lot and partying a lot and kind of discovering myself in a different way. I'd obviously been for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been very driven in terms of just the career sort of thing. Not saying that I didn't enjoy myself, but this was where now I've succeeded in the vision that I had for the last 10 years, because I created this vision when I was 15 years old. Yeah, 6 months go by in Australia, met a great group of people, and met a couple of, met a girl, I guess you could say I lost my heart to her a little bit. I was always a person who wore his heart on his sleeve, my mom would say. And it turns out that all in the space of maybe 4 weeks, my car broke down and I realized I'd bought a dodgy car. So I lost a lot of money on that car. This girl, I found out that she was seeing multiple different guys and I felt very naive. The housemate that I was living with, when I come back one day, he'd just disappeared and hadn't left a message and gone. I thought we were good friends and I took that personally. I started to have a bit of anxiety around this. I had injuries. I wasn't enjoying my role at work. I didn't feel like I was heard or seen. I had anyone to support me. And I was on the other side of the world without anyone really, because I didn't really know anyone deeply. And I really withdrew from a lot of people and went into a bit of a rabbit hole and a spiral of alcohol-induced partying and anxiety and depression, which led on to insomnia. And that was the most challenging period. That and when I was doing my master's were the most challenging periods of my life. I started working through a few things and then met a woman who was very attractive, and I learned a lot of lessons. I ended up getting into a relationship with a woman who was narcissistic with borderline personality disorder, and that took its toll on me whilst I was probably at my lowest I'd been a long time. I was then built up to feel like I was this amazing person, to then be shot down again and be abused. And that destroyed me, destroyed my masculinity and destroyed who I was. And I was rock bottom and I was depressed, anxious, and I couldn't really see a way out of it. I was quite suicidal. I was struggling to make contact with people. I really lost my identity. And that was the lowest point. And working through those times, I decided like I was too shameful to go and speak to a psychologist, that I started to read into psychotherapy myself and started to read into how could I help myself? And one of the first things I did was to look at my health. My health was an issue. I was covered with psoriasis, neck to toe, thick plaques of psoriasis. And I started looking into what that was, trying to get treatment for it. And I really went internal. I didn't trust the external world. I didn't trust people. I went very internal. And at nighttime, because I was struggling with insomnia, I started smoking cannabis, and that made me like quite meditative and dreamy and dissociative. And I started to sit in meditation. I started to sit there with my thoughts and had some very challenging negative thoughts. But the dissociation allowed me to escape the feeling of the thoughts and observe them from a different point. And then I started to make a change. And one of my friends, who's now a very close friend, but at the time he wasn't a close friend, he helped me with some hip issues that I had. I had severe injuries in my hips and I could barely train. I struggled to walk, had back problems. And one of the things he put me onto was a thing called ROMWOD, Range of Motion Workout Daily, which is like you could say a sport style of yin yoga, and it includes breathing, and it included like box breathing in there. And I started to practice that. It was very challenging. But what I noticed when I did it when I was smoking cannabis, I could slow down, I could release the pain, and I could connect to my breath a lot easier. And I started to realize what the breath actually did. So I'd been this respiratory physiologist, but I never really understood the breath in terms of its role, in terms of what it could do and help navigate internal experiences, and the association with that and connecting to the body and how you can move through these emotions. And started to learn all this, right? And it was fascinating. And it took me deep down rabbit holes because I was studying psychotherapy whilst doing this, while smoking cannabis. Started to dabble around playing around with psychedelics, and I had some profound experiences. And it really led me down a route of spirituality. It led me down a route of reading into theology, into religion. And I got so much from this. It moved me from this dogmatic scientist into a person who understood this other esoteric spiritual world, who could grasp this inner narrative, a story of who in essence, of who is my being. It was like a death and rebirth of a new person. It went on for, I'd say, a good 18 months to 2 years of deep inner work that I was really doing on myself to unravel. And as I did that, I started getting into forms of different breath work, playing around with things, and ideas kept coming to me. They kept coming to me, and the idea of performance through health came to me in a dream. And this dream was essentially just like a bolting light of this pyramid. And this pyramid was essentially, I woke up and thought of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it was like, okay, we have physiological needs, we have safety needs, we have belonging needs, we have actualization needs. And I thought to myself, if I can work for all these needs, that's really all we need to do. Is we're always just trying to meet needs in our life. And so I started to formulate concepts around ideas, how I could implement things in myself and work through these needs, and also maybe how I could help other people. And the concept of a performance through health came from me. Is that to be self-actualized, to be the top, you have to work through your physiological needs. So what physiology? How can I help with that? So breathing, sleep, nervous system regulation. And then it's like mindset. How can I help with the mindset? Can I work on my own mindset, be more authentic, understand my values, my prophecies, like who I want to be, my behaviors, explore those. And then my network, and I realized that my network started to change. The people I was hanging out with were different. People were leaving my life, people coming into me, and that built a like-minded people. And I thought, if I can become a leader of that, I can move people towards a common vision. So I started to set visions for my life and what that was and what that looked like. And it was performance through health. It was like, it came to me in a dream. It came to me through what I believed was God. And I was like, this is it. I'm drawn to this. So at the time, I'm still working as a clinical scientist, and I'm going through all these issues. I hadn't spoke to any single person at work at all, apart from my direct line manager. And he was the only person that knew, and he got fired. He didn't get fired, he got let go because of financial reasons. So I didn't have anyone that I could speak to, and I wasn't speaking to anyone about it. And I was just digging away on my own at the time, working through and navigating this inner journey. And yeah, eventually through lots of work, it came out. And I remember a friend of mine, Jason King, he invited me to this group where every Thursday a group of people just come in, they just had talks, and they just talk shit, and they just talked about the stuff that I was into, personal development. And my first day, I just got this story just out, sat down and just told them what I'd been through for the last 2 years to 18 months and everything that happened and everything I'd gone through, and all my shame, my guilt, my fears, and everything just came out. And it was like, I was just like, whoa, I just cried my eyes out at the end, and everyone just was there and just thanked me. And it was like I was heard, I was seen, I had the willingness to be able to share. And at the end of it, they were coming up to me and saying, how good does that feel? Thank you for sharing all that. And that then led to a journey every Thursday, catching up with these guys. And they're my closest friends. They stayed my closest friends. And some of them my biggest mentors, Comrade Francis, Matt Hannum, Michael Duncan. They've all played roles, Jason King, all the other crew, and became very well connected to them. And they supported me in the journey. Now, I had this idea. We read the book, The Alchemist, and it was like, The Alchemist is the way that you create your life. And I got into creative freedom coaching, intuitive coaching. I got some of that. We did some courses. I started reading more into depth psychology and started to understand how the mind works, and went down these rabbit holes. And eventually performance through health was something that I continued just posting and showing up on social media to give value of what I was going through for my personal development, sharing what I was learning, but also helping other people. And yeah, then I got into a relationship with another girl. And what I realized was I was with this woman she was safe. She was 7 years younger than I was. And it was like safe because I was more mature. She was a little bit younger. So I felt like I was protected and she wouldn't be able to hurt me. I'd been hurt a lot through previous relationships. But anyway, COVID struck. And I can remember being with this woman, but also questioning whether it was a relationship. We started having a few conversations around kind of kids and future. And she was obviously only at the time, she would have been, 22, 23, and she wasn't prepared to have those conversations. I was now 30 years old. I was wanting to have those deeper conversations about the future. And I ended up understanding that if we could look at our relationship with our mother, relationship with our father, our relationships in schooling systems, our relationships with our loved ones, we are really understanding where we haven't got those needs met when we're younger. The Maslow's hierarchy, we get our physiological needs from our mother. We get our safety needs from our father. We get our belonging needs from our schooling systems and our peers. We get our self-actualization or our confidence, self-confidence from our partners. And I realized that if I could look at those and extract and journal on them, then potentially I could understand myself enough to understand why I keep getting myself into relationships that I don't want to end up being in, or they don't end up the right way. So I spent 10 weeks microdosing on psilocybin and writing, journaling, meditating every morning during the first 10 weeks of the COVID lockdowns, and discovered that I was in a relationship again I didn't want to be in. I had the courage to then speak up and say, look, I don't think it's right. And we went through a big battle that triggered her. I had to stand my ground and understand myself. And I did a podcast on it, on what I'd learned from that relationship and what I'd learned about myself and the experience. And just put that podcast out. I was already learning how to podcast. I was already starting to learn the skills to develop online coaching and getting a few clients and put myself out there. And then I had this woman reach out to me. And this woman reached out to me and she said, I listened to your podcast about your breakup with your girlfriend. It's the most mature podcast I've ever heard from a male discussing how they feel and how their vulnerability and authenticity about what it was and what they want from their next relationship. And we caught up. We became friends and nothing came of it. We were just good friends for a long time. And I'd continue to work on myself, continue to formulate ideas for performance for health, develop the skills, continue to work. Yeah, and then one day it all changed. We ended up hooking up and that changed the dynamic of our relationship. And she had told me that she was leaving to move to Indonesia in maybe 4 to 6 months' time to pursue her own goals, her vision, the things that she wanted to do in her life. And I asked whether it was right for us to continue this relationship or not. And she said, let's just see how it goes. And we continued to see each other. And I said to myself, if she asked me to come over, I'll consider it, but I won't leave on my terms. I won't leave my life on my terms. I'll only consider it if she asks, and I'll consider my vision. And I remember writing a vision board. And she asked me 2 weeks before she left, she asked me if I'd come. And I went back to my vision board. My vision board was to build an online business, to travel the world, to meet a woman who had these 6 characteristics that I had, values, and she met 6, I think it was 6 out of 7 or 5 out of 6. And it was like, wow, she's really asking me, testing me to see whether I'm actually going to go after my vision. So I quit my clinical career, moved to Indonesia, spent 18 months in Indonesia. And that's where I really knuckled down on understanding breath work. I started to understand freediving and what they applied. I looked into Patrick McEwen's work, looked into XVT, into Brian McKenzie's work, started to understand what people were talking about online, started going to conscious connected breathing sessions, and really started to put myself out there and built Performance Through Health and managed to, within 18 months, get it to a point where I was making 6 figures, helping, I think it was over 60 people, 65 people one-on-one, doing 8 weeks of coaching, understanding breathing, sleep, and nervous system regulation, and just having conversations with people. And that then became quite well known. It was quite kind of I was making a mark. I think I left Australia with 1,900 followers and came back to Australia after those 18 months. I can't remember how many I had, maybe 8,000. But I'd started to socially network with quite big names, those names that I'd mentioned previously, and make a name for myself online, and obviously managed to successfully achieve my goal. Me and Delphine, we traveled for 18 months and barely argued. It was an incredible journey. And we started to form this basic relationship. And then what was happening, it was like, do we go back to Perth or do we stick around in Indonesia? And then Australia was the fearful place, because she'd discovered herself and what she wanted to do. I discovered my business, but it was like, now do we go back to a Western country where it costs a lot of money? And that brought fear for us both. And we both ingrained this mindset between us that if there's a fear, we have to move towards it, not preventing us to do what we wanted to do. So then we came back and we went into the fear, and we've made it work. And after about 3 or 4 months of being in Australia, I had 3 or 4 people reach out to me to ask me to whether I'd mentor them in the science of breathing. And first of all said no, and eventually said yes. And the breath science certification was born. And I, over the space of 6 to 12 months, built this training online. And now there's 85 people who have been through it, or as groups or individuals, and it's built what it is now. And I live this life of the vision I had was 5 years ago, to have a family, to live near the ocean, and for people to be learning from me online, so that I have the freedom to be able to teach and work from anywhere. And I'm now married. I have a 4-week-old baby, Lanny, our daughter. We live 600 meters from the ocean, and I have a whole school of breath science online. And that's the goal, the vision, that's the journey, and that's where we are now. So if you've listened to this all the way through, thank you. I appreciate you. And I appreciate you for being on this journey with me.